Question one, the evolving EV. Oh, and you can send questions up, of course, at any time, including Steeler-related ones. The evolving EV customer. Mike's spoken a lot about this, of course, and that was great information. We'd like to hear now from another research firm, the research arm of J.D. Power, and then a dealer perspective. But I'd like to talk then about how you see the EV customer evolving from sort of the early adopter, tech bro, quote, tree hugger, whatever term you want to use. What does J.D. Power think about the evolving EV customer?
Well, Glenn, the EV customer is evolving. I mean, if we just look at market share, the monthly market share for EVs has doubled in the past year. It's just over 5%. But if we look at the past 10 years, there have been very few choices for these customers. They've all been primarily in the premium, luxury, small compact segments. But we know that 80% of vehicles sold today are SUVs and pickup trucks. So very, very few selection for these customers. And in 2022 alone, there will be roughly 22 new EVs entering the marketplace, 4 trucks, 5 SUVs. So that will absolutely play a role in customer consideration. And that's what we're seeing. Next month, our 2022 EV consideration study comes out, and we are seeing an increase in the mix of customers considering EVs, particularly in the truck segments. The F-150 Lightning is among the top EVs being considered outright. And we're also seeing a lot of mainstream interest in some of the other models. In fact, this is, of course, preliminary data, but the top 3 EVs being considered this year are not Tesla. And that's a big change from last year, where they held those top spots. So, to sum it up, now that more automakers are introducing models, they appear to be tapping into some pent-up interest in mainstream models.
Right. Yeah, myself personally anyway, there's the old joke that America is not really a car market, but a truck market that sells cars to fill the showroom up, right? And so you mentioned Ford, and I think my personal view is if we get an electric pickup truck to really crack the code, that would really broaden this market out dramatically. I would have thought years ago that would never happen, but years ago I wouldn't have thought you could sell an aluminum alloy truck or a pickup truck that didn't have a V8, so we move on. Rob, speaking for all dealers in America, how have you seen people changing who come through your doors of your various stores in the EV space?
Well, I think it's important first to note that all markets are different. And so we see a lot of macro research, and the OEMs come and a lot of macro, we're going to have this percentage by this certain time frame. And we know that throughout the U.S., markets like California are vastly different in adoption curves versus a market like Pittsburgh. So it's important, I think it is important to have that lens as we all look to learn and think about how this plays out over time. From our standpoint, we're seeing, I'd call it increased curiosity, more people asking questions, more people opening up themselves to, and I think the Escalent research confirms that. More people open up to this maybe this is for me at some point, maybe it's not right now. What we've seen, and given the inventory constraints, in some cases we're selling anything we can get in, be it an ICE vehicle, an EV vehicle, whatever we can get in inventory, they're going out. So it may be somewhat more difficult to really assess the true market demand for the vehicles now in a constrained inventory. But the other things that I would talk about would be how do consumers seem to they're interested in the space. They're looking for a transition. Many of them, a growing number, are looking for a transition into the space. Plug-in hybrids are a gentler step into the space. So from our standpoint, we've had a few more questions or a bit more demand on plug-in hybrids. And then where it goes from there, the other comment would be we've seen a growing example of households where somebody has an ICE vehicle and the spouse comes out and will get an EV, and I think they feel like they're mitigating their risk.
Right.
Use the EV to understand the technology, to get used to driving it around town, to see how far I can really drive before I need to charge it. And then if I have to go on a long haul, we always have this ICE vehicle in the garage.
Yeah, that's a good point. Right now, of course, with the shortage upending everything, it's hard to talk about, well, what sales techniques would you use to sell an EV, given that anything with wheels on it, people will buy off the truck at this instant. So, but that's a good point, is to stress in the future, as demand normalizes, if it does, that you don't have to put all your eggs in the EV basket. But, as a friend of mine in Germany says, we in Europe buy cars. In America, you manage fleets. And so to the extent you've got diversified risk, that makes sense. Mike, obviously you've spoken a lot about this topic already, but I'm going to put you on the spot a little bit and throw an audience question at you related to the evolving customer. So far, most people have bought EVs, not most, maybe a lot of them have been wealthy, or at least wealthy enough to have a standalone home in their own garage, the charge point in it, a charging point. One of the great ironies of EVs is the use case where they're best suited, which is running around in urban areas, is where there's no place to plug in. Because you look at the apartment buildings outside on 11th Avenue here, there's 8,000 apartments, there's not 8,000 charge points. Were you able, and again, I'm putting you on the spot, but did your research get into sort of the urban versus rural split or anything at all? You can comment on that.
Yeah.
The place where you most want an EV is where it's hardest to plug it in.
What we find is that the urban-rural split, it's something that we see more on the horizon, but at least in the near term, as we focus on new car buyers, because we're looking at all these vehicles about to hit the marketplace, right, it really skews much more towards the suburbs. Our most urban of these new car buyers is not particularly urban. So it really, I don't want to mitigate the challenge of charging, but there's a couple things I would say about that. One is that, for people who live, to give an example of here, in Manhattan, that's just a very, very small portion of the new vehicle market. So we're not really seeing that as low-hanging fruit. The other thing, too, is EVs have greater range. The concern that existed in the past of if this is a little honeybee that's going to run around and do a lot of errands around towns, I need lots of chargers. The fact is, if you roll out of your garage with pushing 300 miles range, that's an awful lot of errands. You don't need chargers. If you can get one, great, but you can make it back home, no problem.
Yeah, I think this is going to be a bigger challenge in China and in Europe, where a much higher percentage of the population is in a giant apartment block, per se.
Absolutely, we do see that in China and Europe.
Right, okay. Let's see. Next question is the great range debate. And I'm going to lay out the two extreme ends of the spectrum here. One end of the spectrum is what I call the hyper-rational, which is you only drive on average 13 miles a day, so why do you need a 500-mile battery, you idiot? Why aren't you happy with a smaller, lighter battery? And the other end of the spectrum, did Escalent say, was it 400 miles of range was the approximate sort of goal for most EV owners right now, which I think is about the same as the average ICE vehicle's gasoline range, saying, I don't care if I only drive 13 miles a day. For that one time every 3 months when I, go to the vacation home is when I want it. Where do you think the range debate is going to shake out? I think telling consumers you're foolish to want that much range isn't much of a winning argument. But on the other hand, if we have really gigantic batteries, and we've all heard the story about the Hummer EV, whose battery weighs more all by itself than the smallest Mitsubishi, at 3,000 pounds. When we have batteries that big, we use up a lot of electricity just dragging the battery around. It's not an economical solution per se. What does J.D. Power think about the range debate and where that's going?
Well, the range debate is going to continue for a bit. I'd like to call it the range race. But if we look at the ecosystem, batteries are becoming more efficient and technology is going to continue to evolve. Infrastructure is more pervasive and it's going to continue to sprawl, and customers are becoming more aware as they rub elbows with friends that have EVs. Like, we know that the most enthusiastic advocate for EVs are owners themselves. However, that said, we do need to meet the market with where it's at today. And in our consideration study, we know that 6 out of 10 rejectors say they need 500 miles range or more to change their mind.
Right.
But 2 out of 10, 20%, which is a significant number,
Right.
say that they need 300 miles range to change their mind. And that really is where the market is today.
Yeah.
There are plenty of vehicles that can meet that range and more coming. But we do see a point of diminishing return. In our ownership study, customer satisfaction begins to level out beyond 300 miles.
Yeah.
So, really at the end of the day, customers don't want to be left stranded. We talked about charging at home. 85% of EV customers do charge at home. So they wake up to a full charge, which is more than enough for their daily drives. So it comes down to those longer journeys and giving them confidence. And that's where fast charging is really going to be the key, making sure that fast charging is available on interstates and highways. So to sum it up, we do see a bit of a disconnect between what customers are asking for and then what they're actually doing.
Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned that about charging overnight. I'm surprised no OEM has yet seized on the slogan of wake up every morning with a full tank. Because on the one hand, you're very worried about being stranded by the side of the road because the battery's ended. On the other hand, wake up every day not having to worry about if you need to go to the gas station that day. So I don't know. Rob, any early vibrations on the range? Again, you cover multiple brands and multiple locations, but
Sure.
Any comment on the range debate?
So I'm clearly not an expert in, with the market research that the two on either side of me have, but I would just offer the 300 to 400 miles seems, is it akin to what people can have in an ICE car? That seems to make sense to me. Another observation I would have in going through this process from a dealer standpoint, in this large seismic change that everybody is rushing to get infrastructure built around. Oftentimes, history might tell us when there's this large seismic change with a lot of capital being invested from all parties, that we'll look back 5 years, 7 years, 10 years and say, boy, we kind of messed this up.
Yeah.
At least this part of it. We did the best we could, but we wouldn't have done it exactly that way. And so as we sign off, as dealers are asked to sign off on charging stations, and if people are, I'm not an expert, don't profess to be one, but if 85% of the people are charging at home and then going and doing their day's work and going back home and charging, the plethora of charging stations in and around the community, I can see it in the highway system, certainly.
Yeah.
But I could be all wet. It's something, as we stroke checks, it's certainly something that I think about.
Yeah, you do want to future-proof the technology, too.
Yep.
Yeah. Do I detect there's a Betamax in your basement somewhere?
No Betamax.
Yeah. I've got an 8-foot diameter satellite dish in my backyard. I gotta just hang clothes off of. But yeah, a good point. Mike, you want to weigh in on the range debate here and where we think it might stabilize or how it might go?
Sure. I mean, we, very much like Elizabeth said, we do see a diminishing return when you get around 300. So there's definitely a sweet spot. It's moving as the technology evolves. But, right now, reaching for 500, 600-mile range EVs is something that gets headlines and maybe works for really high-end consumers, but we're not seeing that that's what more mainstream consumers are asking on any level. Now, don't get me wrong, the flip side of that is come to market today with an EV with 140-mile range, and that's the kiss of death. But I also wanted to back up what Rob had said, that from an infrastructure standpoint, all of our research supports the idea that anytime I see something that says, well, we need X number of chargers to help EVs. Well, which chargers are those? Where are they going to be? Those are just as critical as how many, because if you install a bunch of slow chargers in places people aren't going to go, that's not really helping solve the problem.
That's my personal observation on this has been, and that's always dangerous, but we see all these charts showing the number of chargers just going up, ski ramps straight up and everything. But I think this is one area where the devil will be in the details, because the first, second, or third time you go to a charger and it's offline, or it doesn't fit my car's plug, or it ate my credit card, there seems to be a lot of static on the actual operation of the charging network, as opposed to just how many points there are and where they are. And that's one thing you can say about evil, old, dead dinosaur gasoline. Everyone in this room can operate every gasoline pump in America, and they kind of all work all the time. So this is a high bar for EV charging to reach. Okay, so we've talked about customers, we've talked about a little bit of the technology and the range. Let's switch to, I think there's quite a few dealers in the audience, as I understand. Let's talk about dealers dealing with EVs. We've heard a lot today about getting ready for EVs, about investing in charging and things like that. I'd like to talk about, what you think are the tangible next steps that dealers need to do to really jump on this beyond just complying with their OEM's requirements. One of the challenges, I'm going to throw one out there, but you don't have to respond to it, just the one that comes to my mind is, I think of a customer buying an EV as saying, I'm buying an EV, but I need to know about the charging, as you pointed out on your slide, and also about the incentives. And do you get customers getting interested in the technology, but, well, was that a federal tax credit, or is it dollars on the hood? Do I need a form I fill out and drop off at the state level? Who do I call? Do I call the utility company to get a charger installed, or you? So one of my questions in general is, how does the salesperson manage this expanded role of not just selling the vehicle and its benefits, but also hovering out there is how to get it charged and how to get all the incentives that may be due to me. But anyway, that's just my point. What would be J.D. Power's sort of advice on how dealers can get ready to sell these things?
Sales staff and customers, they like to differentiate their vehicles from one product from another, and it's no different with EVs. And there's a ton of really positive features with EVs that stand out from ICE that the dealers can focus on. One of the top reasons for buying, one is that driving performance, so pointing out the torque off the line and the quiet ride. A second is the innovative features. Oftentimes, specific innovative features are tied to EVs. Some of the connectivity software, the vehicle-to-grid or bidirectional charging. I mean, now an EV can be used as a power source. The interior spaciousness, because the packaging is completely different with a battery versus a drivetrain. And really unique storage opportunities, like a frunk.
Right.
Right.
Porsche had one of those in the 911 a long time ago. Sorry. Okay, go ahead. Yes, the front.
And also the styling. The OEMs have done a great job trying to differentiate some unique EV styling cues, and that resonates with customers. But another area completely, as you pointed out, is that value proposition and being able to educate the customer on the value proposition. It can be confusing. There are government incentives and regional incentives and utility rebates. And some of the OEMs have relationships with networks where they're giving discounts. So at the local level and at the model level, to have this information for the sales force will go a long way. And finally, I think, and it's one of the most important things, is getting customers into vehicles. We know that they're 3 times as likely to consider an EV if they've just been in one, and 4 times more likely if they've driven one. So, that's a great opportunity for these brick and mortar dealerships to get customers in and have them take a test drive.
That's another irony of our current situation. To develop EV demand, as you point out, people should be test driving them. And so maybe a dealership would have a few models at the parking lot at the Whole Foods or something to gen up demand. But you don't want more demand right now because you can't deliver the friggin' thing. So, that would be a good thing to do, is get more people driving the cars, but you don't have the cars for them to drive. Rob, are you gearing up your sales force to handle this complex equation, or what other things are you thinking about in terms of getting ready?
Yeah, so if the question is what can dealers do to be best prepared for this sea change, I think it starts with the dealer opening themselves up and their companies up to possibility. And I think the dealers and the franchise system has historically shown the dealer's ability to evolve through change and rampant change. And so this will be another historic change that I think the majority of all dealers are prepared. There's, as has been mentioned, certainly the level of sales training, not just from a product standpoint, but also from how the technology works and what kind of electrical service people will need at home, and what the incentives, be it local or federal incentives, it's a more from that standpoint, it's more complicated. So there's a higher burden on us to have more sophisticated and comprehensive training for our salespeople. There's certainly a technical challenge in recruiting and training those that will be working on the vehicles. So there is a lot on our plate, and there's a lot that we'll need to ramp up. And the last thing that I might mention on the dealer and OEM relationship and strategy, I think it was commented on this morning, but we're going through such a sea change of things that are coming at us. To me, the OEMs that can be most aligned with their dealers through this transition in as transparent of a way. And some of the things as a dealer, what we hear are these products are coming. We have these initiatives by 2030, and you need to buy so many charging stations from us. But more specific details as far as what the next 2, 3, 4, 5 years look like in our market, not the U.S., but in our market, so we can prepare for our market based on the nuances of those markets. That information, I believe, is out there or should be out there, and I think the OEMs could be a big help in transitioning this by sharing that information more so and with more transparency than's been done today.
Yeah. If we want transparency...
Thanks for the applause.
Right. No. If we want transparency for customers and dealers, we need to have transparency between dealers and OEMs.
Yes.
I absolutely agree. Before I close with Mike, we receive here questions from the audience, and we are servants of the audience here. So, do the Steelers really think they can win with quarterback Mitch Trubisky? You can pass on this if you'd like.
Speaking to a friend from Cleveland.
I'm not talking about any Cleveland quarterbacks.
I'll just point out that there are 6 Super Bowls achieved between the Pittsburgh-Cleveland corridor, and I'll just leave it at that.
Mm-hmm. I think we should have given him more money. Okay, Mike, any final comments on what dealers can do specifically getting ready beyond what we've already heard?
Yeah, I think just a couple I'd point out from the perspective we have is that, some of the information consumers are seeking related to EVs is pretty specialized knowledge. I'm not sure it's fair to assume your average salesperson is going to know the intricacies of the tax rebates or, local installers or things like that. So, that's where we hear from consumers. They're pretty open to the salesperson they talk to may not have all the answers. If there's someone at the dealership that maybe is more specialized, that's something they're pretty open to. But they are, they're turning to dealers more than they're turning to utilities or any other source for information that, quite frankly, we realize, you'd logically go to one of these other sources for. For instance, electric rate plans. They're saying, I'd rather go to my dealer than my utility, which is pretty surprising for us. I mean, the other thing I would say, too, is just to touch on what Rob had mentioned, we're seeing levels of excitement from consumers when they drive or buy an EV that in many cases is excitement they haven't had since their first cars. They'll tell us that. And so that idea that, if you can try to change the perspective from EVs being something that's, eating your lunch to here's an opportunity that, we haven't seen in decades, that's what consumers are telling us. And so there's so many new areas of, they get excited, they want accessories for it, they want, they're really, they're kind of opening up their checkbooks because of that. It's really neat to see. And so hopefully everyone can kind of think about this as more of an opportunity because in many cases for consumers it is.
And so maybe not every salesperson has to have all that knowledge, but maybe a dedicated EV person at this dealership who can answer those questions might be enough, at least as we get started. I'm glad you closed on that opportunity. We may all be at different levels of acceptance and skepticism regarding EVs, but a 1,000 horsepower Lucid is quite a ride. I do agree. Thank you very much.